at the Center for International Law at the National University of Singapore. I think it's probably fair to say that this is the first time that there is a panel dedicated to One Health at the American Society of International Law annual meeting. And that's because really this concept of One Health has been an area which has been researched and debated in the past decade or so within scientific circles, but really has only, especially in the past 2 years, made its way to the international legal discourse. So just to give you a sense, a couple of months ago, I was at the 7th One Health Congress, and there were really thousands of attendees, but most of them were really infectious disease specialists, veterinarians, environmentalists, and we were really just a handful of lawyers. So I think that kind of visualizes to you where we stand in terms of the international law involvement in this topic. And why is that? So first of all, what is actually One Health? I'll let the panelists talk about that in great detail, but I think the gist of it is really the idea that human health can't be can't really be protected in isolation anymore. So if we really want to improve human health and protect it, we need to realize that it's really interlinked with animal health and with environmental health. And you know, if you look at the image or the logo of One Health, you really see, it kind of really depicts this image. It's very often kind of depicted as a triangle or 3 connected circles, really kind of this understanding that these 3 elements are strongly interlinked. So why is this suddenly becoming of interest to international lawyers? So quite obviously, the trigger has been COVID-19, which like most of the other epidemics and pandemics of the past decades has been, like SARS, MERS, Zika, Ebola, has been a zoonotic disease, meaning a disease that essentially kind of spills over, jumps from animals to humans. So we have this realization that if we want to be serious about pandemic prevention, then we need to start working at prevention at a much earlier stage, or what Gianluca Berchi and his colleagues have termed as deep prevention, and I'm sure he'll talk about that soon, because under the current international legal framework, so international health regulations, really essentially they really only kick in once an outbreak occurs. So we need to start thinking about prevention at a much earlier stage. And this realization is really, we see that now within the discussions over the new pandemic treaty and at the WHO, where One Health is really kind of becoming a key concept. So if you look at the draft treaty, you'll see that it really recognizes this principle of One Health and actually dedicates a part of the treaty to furthering this concept. So I think it's fair to say that One Health is a new concept that is really has now made it is here to stay in international law. But of course, implementation of this concept and operationalizing it is going to be a big challenge. One of the main challenges from an international law perspective is that international law and also international organizations have historically been siloed. So we have different treaties, different international norms, and different organizations working in each of these 3 sectors of health, human health, animal health, and the environment. So how do we mesh this all together? How do we create synergies? How do we enable cooperation between these different organizations? These are all kind of the things that we'll be talking about during the panel today. So with that, I really want to introduce our excellent panelists today. Gianluca Berchi, who's to my left. He's professor for international law at the Graduate Institute and was previously the legal counsel at the WHO. Nitin Ramakrishnan, who's with us by Zoom, who's a consultant with the Third World Network. Dr. Pilar Ramon Pardo, who's here to my left, who's the lead of the Antimicrobial Resistance Special Program in the Communicable Diseases and Environmental Determinants of Health Unit at the Pan American Health Organization here in DC, and with us over Zoom, Chadia Vanus, who's the One Health coordinator of the World Organization for animal health. And before we begin, of course, you all know this by now, but anyone seeking CLE credit must go now and at the end of our panel to an ASIL volunteer. So without further ado, I'd like to give the floor to Gianluca. Thank you.
Thank you, Ayelet, and thank you for inviting me. It's great to be back in person and see friends and colleagues in 3D rather than on a screen. And this year we have 4 panels on health, so it's quite historical for the American society. I guess it's one of the good consequences of COVID, at least from a legal perspective. So I'm going to jump right into it because I don't want to take too long, and maybe a bit of an introduction to this topic, and in particular, what does international law have to do with One Health? First of all, and I hope this works, yes. So, empirical consideration, the most of the infectious diseases that make the headlines come from animals. So whether you want to use a more holistic perspective or anthropocentric perspective, we do have a problem of animal and humans coming into contact in a way that spills pathogens. And if you can read it, if it's big enough, this slide that comes from a report of the IPBES gives a sense of the dimension of the problem and gives a sense also how much we don't know. COVID was a surprise, was a coronavirus, but there are tons of viruses out there, in particular in certain species of animals that we know, rodents, primates, certain kind of birds, and livestock. So we do have an evident problem, however we see it. And what are the drivers of the problem? How do pathogens move from animals to humans? Fundamentally are environmental and economic. Environmental, so the drivers are obviously the drivers of environmental degradation. It's desertification, it's loss of biodiversity, it's climate change, it's land use change. It's all phenomena that push wildlife into human spaces. But it's also the intensive farming that makes animal species, mixes species together, very often in unhealthy situations. These are stressed animals that get easily sick. There's a clear link with antimicrobial resistance that my colleague will deal, because farmers dump tons of antibiotics on healthy animals, generating antimicrobially resistant pathogens. So, and also animal and food trade. So the drivers are multiple. And so the concept of One Health has developed to respond to this complexity, to the fact that, as Ayelet said, we have an interface of human health, animal health, and environmental considerations. And the concept of One Health has been coined in the last 15 years or so to encapsulate this complexity. So this is a definition that comes from the work of FAO, WHO, the Organization of Animal Health, and now UNEP, that form what we call a quadripartite. And I'm very happy that colleague Chadia Wannous from the Organization of Animal Health is with us today. And when I was in WHO, these organizations sometimes were working in silos, but now they're finally working together, I think. And that, to me, is also a good effect of COVID. So we have institutional movement to try to make sense of One Health. But as Ayelet once said, we need to translate it into operational terms, because it's intuitive that the environment, the animal kingdom, if you want, and the human species interrelate. But what does it mean in operational terms? How do we make sense of it from an international law point of view? So it's not a surprise. The One Health is taking center stage in the current negotiations in WHO, both on this new pandemic treaty and also on amendment to the international health regulations. And negotiators are struggling quite a bit in how to express it in regulatory terms. So the European Union actually in the last few days has come with a fairly developed proposal that aims very much at prevention. COVID shows that once we have a spillover turning into an outbreak and the outbreak becoming global, frankly, we are in trouble. So there's a clear emphasis on prevention. But what does prevention mean? And that's, in a way, the topic what I want to talk about in the last few minutes. And what this graphic you see on the slides is something that we produced in the Global Health Center in Geneva for a workshop that we gave in June last year, and it's also the subject of an article I published together with some colleagues on Lancet. Fundamentally looking at pandemics as a cycle. So upstream, you have the environmental drivers that I mentioned, but also intensive farming and also animal trade. And these are areas, at least some of them, that have their own international regulation. Biodiversity, climate change, desertification, to a certain extent, maybe land use change, and so on. So I don't want to say that this is the best regulation, but there are rules of international law that address some of the drivers, or the really upstream environmental drivers that push animals towards humans. So that's what they call upstream, and that's environmental part. If we are unlucky, and a spillover occurs, and an outbreak turns into an international outbreak, we move to the right part of the figure, to the yellow part, if you want. Because at that point, we need to contain, we need to detect, and we need to control. And here, too, we have some rules of international law. First and foremost, the international health regulations, whose main purpose is precisely to prepare the world to detect and contain quickly, but not to prevent. In a way, the trigger is a disease which is already circulating in humans. But also trade rules, for example, the agreement on sanitary and phytosanitary measures, because you can have obviously pathogen traveling in live animals, in food, in plants, in vegetables, and so in a way the SPS with the sanitary standards can help detect and block and try to control the spread of food poisoning, for example. So my point is that, our point is that where we have a regulatory gap is in the middle, is in the, if you want, in the space where humans and animals come together. That's what we call midstream prevention. It sounds like a bit of a sexy term, but it's to differentiate the really upstream environmental driver to the downstream aspect of trying to block what is already happening. And our consideration is that that space is not really well regulated. And so, in a way, our work, and if you want a bit of advocacy, was to try to pass the message to the negotiators in WHO that is the space that, in our view, should be the priority space for regulation, where you really try to fill that space, to reduce, if not prevent, the risk of zoonotic spillover from animal to humans. But what does it mean in concrete terms? And here we have, in a way, a number of proposals that are not rocket science, in a way, what you see also in other environmental treaties, in other regulatory regimes, on measures that could address this gap. First of all, the surveillance. Surveillance takes place in silos, environmental, animal, humans. So you cannot merge everything, but there has to be a way to bridge and to communicate. If there is a interesting pathogen detected in monkeys, detected in ducks, and so on, it cannot remain in the veterinary space. It has to be fed into, as a preventive measure, into the human health space, if you want. So integrated surveillance. But surveillance is a means to an end. And our emphasis was very much on the need for regulatory measures at the national level. And here we go back to, I just went to a panel on climate change and plastic pollution, whether you have a bottom-up approach, because the hotspots are different in different countries. In Asia can be these wet markets that maybe were the source of COVID. In many countries it's intensive farming. In other countries bushmeat consumption is sort of traditional feeding practices and so on. So you need to adapt regulatory measures to the particular national environment. And very importantly, involving local communities. So this cannot become a disempowerment, disenfranchisement, impoverishment of local communities that are often are the ears and the eyes on the ground that the first to detect that all our birds are dying and now people are getting sick. So there is a need for this clear bottom-up, very inclusive approach. Then we need a science policy interface. That's nothing new if you deal with environmental law. This is obviously a moving target in scientific terms. Just the first slide that I showed you shows the limit of our knowledge and the fact that we are really grasping in the dark when it comes to pathogens out there. So a science policy interface that not only curates the science, like in the IPCC in climate change, but that gives clear direction for policy making. It cannot be just bottom-up national measures in a random term. There has to be standards that somehow guide and make states accountable for the measure that they take. Obviously, then we need institutional integration. At the institutional level, as I said, we are talking about, at the very least, 4 institutions. And these institutions, obviously, while maintaining their own mandate, they need to cooperate, they need to work together. And if in the future we have an instrument, whether it's a treaty, whether it's something else, obviously it cannot be left to WHO alone. And so as if some of you has worked in international organization, you know how difficult it is to create these bridges, nobody wants to be coordinated. But this kind of integration is very necessary. And then finally, the linkage with antimicrobial resistance, in particular with regard to intensive farming, because we have, that to me is a time bomb, even bigger and more scary than the tough luck of the poor boy eating a bat, an infected bat in Guinea in 2012 and starting the Ebola outbreak. This is a time bomb that happens at a doorstep. And then finally, and that's my final slide, obviously some of the less issue-specific measures, but typically supportive measures that have to be part, in our view, of a regulatory package. A set of principles, and the draft of the pandemic treaty has quite a number of principles that should give a certain policy coherence to the more detailed regulations. Obviously, there's a huge resistance by certain developing countries that see this as another health security obsession by rich countries dumping very expensive obligations on them without nothing in return. So there has to be the sense of equity, the sense of differential treatment for developing countries, of assurances of financing should be part of the package. It looms large in the bigger negotiation of the pandemic treaty, but I think it applies specifically to the One Health problem. And then finally, issue of accountability or compliance, that obviously are nothing new in international law. I think there is a panel this afternoon on this. And again, how you bring all these dimensions together, all these different metrics, and turn them into something that can be assessed, that can be discussed, that can be reviewed. And this is something the public health community is not familiar at all. There is a lot of resistance with the idea that we must come in front of a committee of experts and discuss how we manage our healthcare system and so on. So that's also a bit of a communication, of a culture gap, not just a regulatory gap that has to be filled. And then this is the latest news on COVID-19 after the pangolin, after the incident in the lab in Wuhan. The latest culprit seems to be this poor ugly animal, which is a raccoon dog, that apparently was one of those slaughtered horribly in the market in Wuhan, and they found in the genomic sequences of COVID-19 filed by Chinese scientists on one of the databases, they found I'm not a technician, traces of this animal, basically. So that seems to be the latest theory on how COVID-19 started. And then again, it shows the level of uncertainty, the level of scientific uncertainty, and the absolute need to put a regulatory frame on this. And I'll stop at that. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Gianluca. Let's move on to Nitin, who's with us on Zoom.
Right. Oh, just a second. Some problem with my screen sharing. Thank you, moderator, and thank you, Professor Bursi, whom I always love to hear, for giving a very clear, thorough understanding about what One Health is and what could we do in terms of development of pandemic instrument. Let me start philosophically, coming from a land which chants the mantra of oneness. Let me ask a question. How should we understand human knowledge? I mean, the whole corpus of of knowledge that humanity holds. Is it jointly integrated as one, or it should be seen as a several one? In all civilizations that wanted their values to be informed by scientific evidence and conception of truth, the answer was always knowledge is singular. Egam sat bahuda vadanti vipra, says the Rig Veda. Nevertheless, for several reasons, including the limitations of human intelligence and the fallible moral integrity of human beings, legal systems are created in a way that this principle is applied only in a remote fashion. Despite aspirations of for one law being applied to all equally, all political systems, including the world's most hegemonic orders, use legal pluralism, separation of powers, and ministerialization of governance in one form or the other. This is a reflection that the quest for efficiency and better alignment with science has always been well balanced, even at times by excluding knowledge to those who lack morally or in skills. This was important because justice needs to be served to everyone, and we cannot do injustice to one in order to serve justice to others. However, with increasing application of big data and artificial intelligence, we are under an impression that governance is best when it served the interest of maximum and not necessarily justice to each. With the development of this new technologies, in a sense, we have started to think that AI can satisfy all our dreams of truth-based and knowledge-based universal order. The rally behind the idea of incorporating One Health approach into the proposed WHO convention or treaty on pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response is the latest manifestation of this aspiration. This must be balanced with the need for a sensible and responsible design of global health governance. Otherwise, we get into this labyrinth of genomic or biosurveillance, perhaps stripped out of any possibility to have timely, equitable access to life-saving medicines. At the same time, we may live inside this labyrinth with constant fear of biosecurity concerns. This I'm saying is because One Health approach has been there not necessarily from the last 2 decades. It has been identified in the world's most ancient knowledge traditions. And the recent interest in the One Health approach has been coupled with the quest for increased genomic surveillance. That's the basic political line which we should perhaps see in the international law of making concerned with One Health approach. Now, going back to this, the question at this stage which needs to be asked is that whether this set of practice, which is it's a wonderful set of practice, scientific set of practices, which includes interdisciplinary, multi-stakeholder, multi-sectoral approach towards public health. That's what One Health has been always. The question here is whether this set of practice needs a legal impetus to function properly. And if yes, whether this set of practice is readily available for the adoption into the legal framework, or it needs to undergo an adaptation process. These questions are very important given the current politics of international lawmaking. This current politics, I would like to present before you in 2 schemes. First, the divide between developed countries and developing countries on the goal of the new pandemic instrument. And secondly, the industry academic complex acting to opportunize the moment to secure their interest no matter what happens to the public interest. The developing countries are devastated with very limited support of equitable access to health products such as diagnostic, vaccines, therapeutics during COVID-19 pandemic. Their request for scaling up of the production was hindered. Their request for removal of barriers such as IP were met with stiff resistance and even responded with additional administrative burdens to implement flexibilities of TRIPS agreement. Hence, in the interest of justice, developing countries have now come together along with some of the good friends from developed countries to ensure some form of equity in the public health emergency response and pandemic response. But once again, the developed countries want to shift the focus from the public health response and equity into preparedness and surveillance. I use this phrase once again because the current law of public health emergency of international concern, that is IHR 2005, suffers from this very same kind of skewed focus. I mean, it's a health law which don't even use the word medicines except in the model shipment and maritime certificates attached to the annex. On-ground experts in the recent international INB, international intergovernmental negotiating bodies intersessional meetings alerted, if not deplored, that the drifting of attention away from the response in international negotiating body. It must be kept in mind that an idea like One Health was nearly absent in the initial debates of COVID-19 response and WHO health legal reforms. One Health approach thus is a newfound instrument in the shift to shift the focus of the developed countries. Is a newfound instrument of the developed countries to shift the focus to front load and capture maximum attention in the negotiations on this approach. This would leave very less time and energy to discuss the need for equity in response. A practical reflection of this we can see on the focus of biosurveillance in the works of One Health high-level panel, as well as the neglect of international cooperation as a pathway of change in joint plan of action of the quadripartite. I would just show some slides which shows you how this focus has been moving towards a biosurveillance project. This is the definition, or this is the kind of approach towards prevention of zoonotic spillover proposed by the One Health high-level panel. And this is the pathway of change proposed by Joint Plan of Action, where there is no understanding about international cooperation and assistance. Meanwhile, I would say the academic and industry complex is setting to set approaches and institutions maximize free data inputs without necessary governance mechanism in place, jeopardizing national sovereignty over natural resources. There are at least 3 large-scale industry players who are constantly been increasing their investments in zoonotic hotspots across the continent, while there are certain innocent civil society organizations, animal health organizations, and scientific experts calling for One Health approach and free data integration. Most of these data integration capacities exist only in the developed world or only with the global elite upon whom international law has no reach or minimal reach, just the way D.S. Chimney has argued in his article on customary international law in ASIL's journal. This means for any benefits to flow back to the developing countries on One Health, they are at the mercy of the benefit sharing law flowing from the Convention on Biological Diversity, to which a major developed country is not yet a party. The fact that this country is co-hosting the world's largest database on genetic sequences is also noteworthy. A reflection of this unaccountable approach could also be seen in the development of Joint Plan of Action and its section on accountability. If you could see the slide, you would see the quadripartite executives being accountable for the implementation of One Health Joint Plan of Action. But as an international lawyers, we would all know that it is very important to understand who these executives are and how they are accountable, how an interorganizational collaboration or initiative can be made accountable to an international in an international legal sphere. It's a very interesting area of research, perhaps many of us could do in the coming years. There is no reference to quadripartite executives either in the websites or in the meeting as well. So therefore, my answer to the first question is that even if we do not set up a legal obligation, One Health will have its promotion because private sector is interested. Agencies like quadripartite and One Health high-level panel would continue no matter whether the states have a legal obligation or not. The question of adoption and adaptation is thus to irrelevant. However, assuming that there are still further requirements of public purpose by which One Health needs to be incorporated into the pandemic instrument, we need to check the definition and the scope of this approach. This definition, which was already discussed by Professor Bursi, follows the same trend of One Health evolution of the last 2 decades, which was critiqued by scholars saying that it misses social dimension and it also misses fairness and justice dimension. You would see the word approach mobilizes multiple sectors, disciplines, communities. So in a sense, it speaks about integrating community response and other things at the subnational level. And also it speaks about integrated surveillance and sharing of information at the global level. Perhaps equity between countries, equity between states, when it comes to an international level, is missing in its definition and and its approaches. You can also see the principles of One Health high-level panel speaks about...
Nitin, can I please ask you to start wrapping up your comments?
Sure. I mean, there's only 5 more. I mean, there's only 5.
Yeah, we have 1 more minute. 1 more minute, please.
Oh, sure, right.
Okay.
Yeah. So the equity between sectors and disciplines, but parity between socio-political and multicultural entities. So you could analyze why these model is not adaptable directly into the legal text. Going to the last part of my presentation, which is what is the reason for the adoption of One Health into the pandemic context, is basically shown as zoonotic pathogens. My previous speaker also spoke about it, but also it comes with a kind of a note that this approach should also be applied through application of existing instruments and initiatives. If we go back and see, there are at least more than 100 initiatives being mentioned in the under One Health Joint Plan of Action. In Appendix 2 and in Box 1, there are more things. Most of them are not negotiated by member states. So it is problematic that what obligations that member states are going to adopt through this. Now, if we go back to another advancement of international law, which happened in biodiversity and health, I mean, the COP meeting happened in December, it's very clear that there has been a clear understanding about what One Health is, because they very clearly speak to address the integration, the holistic approach. One Health is one among the holistic approaches towards biodiversity and health, and we need to address One Health to consequently reduce the risk of pathogen spillover. So
Nitin, we really need to move on. I'm sorry, because we're already at half-time. Nitin, you really have to finish. We have to move on. I'm sorry.
Right.
So if you could just say a final word, that would be great.
Yeah, of course, I'm sure. So with this, I am actually ending that if a pandemic news treatment, last sentence is that if a new pandemic treaty has to incorporate this particular idea, first of all, they have to have a different understanding about what is One Health prevention, One Health surveillance, and One Health response in 3 different aspects, and needs to provide equity, means of implementation, as well as fairness to the developing countries who would join this pact. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Please, Pilar, go ahead.
Now is working. Okay. So if I may have my slides, fantastic. So it's a pleasure being here with you, and as well, it's fantastic to be preceded by Gianluca and Nitin, because many of the concepts are already explained to the audience, so I will be able to move forward very quickly. So I will be speaking of first, a disclosure. I am a medical doctor, I am not a lawyer, so please, apologies for any kind of misunderstanding or the terms that they are not perfectly correct. But this is the perspective from the public health perspective, right? So we are going to speak a little bit about One Health in Latin America and the Caribbean with a special focus on antimicrobial resistance. So this is the concept that was previously explained by Gianluca and by Nitin about this complexity of the human-animal environment interface and how the pathogens can be selected and can very quickly spread in the ecosystem, and the relevance on One Health in this context. And as well, it's much more complicated because we have the social determinants and as well the environmental determinants affecting this kind of ecosystem. So the big question is how legislation, regulation, IHR, the pandemic treaty can influence, can prevent the emergency and the dissemination of the communicable diseases. Jean-Luc mentioned that many of the diseases are coming from, especially communicable diseases, are coming from the animals. They are zoonotic. more or less 60% of all the communicable diseases are coming from animals. But when we are speaking about emergent communicable diseases, the proportion is even higher. Close to 90% of the new emergency diseases are coming from the animals. So this is a very well-known map with this kind of increasing new virus, new pathogens that are emerging all over the world and spreading around. And as well, the question is how national or international legislation, IHR, the pandemic treaty, can stop and prevent the emergency and the dissemination of diseases. We are now in a very interesting moment when we are seeing a transformation in the global health governance. This is the pandemic treaty. This is the zero draft. It's available for the discussion and for reading. And this is one of the, I think, the biggest movements to start discussing global health governance in a different perspective. And as well, in parallel, there is the revision of the International Health Regulation 2005 to be able to accommodate to the new challenge and the new scenario. We have been speaking a lot about the collaboration among different international organizations. This is the quadripartite. We started as tripartite, and recently, last year in March, UNEP joined the club, and we are the quadripartite. And this is very close related to the joint action plan that NITIN was presenting. So this is, and as well, the first pathway, remember there was legislation, advocacy, and financing. So this is as well very close related to the way that we understand. In the Americas, recently, that was in June 2021, the member state approved a specific policy about One Health. And it's quite comprehensive because this is not only neglected diseases, emergency and endemic and emergent zoonotic diseases, antimicrobial resistant and foodborne diseases related very closely to food safety. So this is the document that was endorsed by member states in the Americas as well to protect about One Health. Antimicrobial resistance, this is as well very complex cycle where there is a lot of opportunities for regulations, and it is been aggravated in the last years related to global movements, climate change, and as well the COVID has an important impact. So now we are speaking about AMR like a silent pandemic, and we can discuss later more in that. So now, just speaking about AMR and the way that the countries are looking to tackle to decrease the impact of antimicrobial resistance, this is an example of the multi-sector coordination on AMR. So basically, the countries, they develop national action plan, multi-sectoral action plan, and here we are speaking about the integration of different institutions, the Ministry of Health, Agriculture, and animal husbandry, and others. So there is a multi-sectoral coordination that is increasing and is improving along the year, but it's quite hard to get like a common work plan and a common approach and a common financing for these national action plans. This is the way that the committees are organized. So you see most of them, they have the animal, terrestrial, and as well human health in the committees, but only 25% of all the countries, they have all the sectors involved in these antimicrobial resistant multi-sector committees. One specific and very relevant piece for AMR containment is legislation. Legislation on antimicrobial use, because antimicrobial use is one of the main drivers for antimicrobial resistance. So as you will see, there is most of the countries, they have the laws on regulating the use of antimicrobials in the human sector, but very few or many less they have for other sectors, pesticides, aquatic, and so on. So this is important, and as well, there is less than half of the countries that they have the legislation are able to monitor, for instance, the total sales of antimicrobials. So still there is a step further that is needed. legislation on use of antimicrobials in human health is a long, is a very old topic, and we have a lot of revision on many countries. They have this kind of legislation more than 20 years ago, but recently there are two examples, one from Argentina, other from Peru, that they are as well revitalizing and strengthening regulation on antimicrobial resistance and as well antimicrobial stewardship. But legislation is not enough. So we have the experience as well in Latin America that legislation make an impact in the consumption of antimicrobials. Here are the examples of Chile and Argentina, but it's a short-term impact. At the long term, the level of consumption go back to the previous situation. We cannot speak about antimicrobial resistance without mentioning the Codex Alimentarius. This is a joint collaboration with FAO and WHO, and as well it takes some kind of the regulation, especially as well related to integrated antimicrobial surveillance, as well to contain AMR. This is as well another example of regulations on the standards. FAO, they have a very important work on analyzing the relevant legislation on AMR from the food and agriculture sector. That you see this is extremely complex. They have a tool, and the countries are applying the tool to better understand how to improve legislation, improve regulation, and trying to find synergies under One Health approach. And the last piece of information. So we know that the COVID-19 pandemic had an incredible impact on AMR. And that this is like emergencies of new AMR mechanisms, new pathogens, and the spread of one. And we produce of course, these pathogens were detected at country level. We had from PAHO, from the Pan American Health Organization, raised alerts for the other countries to be able to detect and contain. And many of these pathogens and mechanisms were notified through IHR. So you see there is a close relation in that sense. So just to conclude, there are few national intersectoral laws on One Health and on AMR, and mostly they are in high-income countries. The second is that existing and under development international regulation and standards, we have a few then, IHR, Codex Alimentarius, and the pandemic treating. But we know that the reinforcement and monitoring of regulation is a challenge. But as well, the change of behavior, especially to address AMR, is even more critical. So that is all from my end, and thank you very much. Back to you.
Thank you so much. Chadia?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Oh, there you go. Okay, yes.
I will share my screen. Give me 1 second. Can you see it in full mode?
Yes, now we can.
All right. Thank you so much, Gianluca. All the previous speaker made my life easier because you covered a lot of what I wanted to say. It shows that we are aligned in many of the aspects. I just want to talk to you about our work. You saw this graph showed by Pilar to highlight the issue that One Health is not new to us. We didn't discover it now. We're actually working on One Health at least since 2003 with the SARS pandemic, and made this formal collaboration between FAO, OIE at the time, now WOHA, the World Organization for Animal Health, and WHO through the tripartite collaboration, and prioritized three diseases, which is pandemic influenza or zoonotic influenza, AMR, and rabies. And then from there, we moved to our quadripartite collaboration. We just signed it last year in March 2022, where we included UNEP as an equal partner of this collaboration, so we can address the environmental aspects of One Health efficiently and effectively. because we understand that the drivers are most of them linked to the way human behave and use our natural resources and treat our environment. So from there, we have the mandate from our member countries to work together on the One Health approach. And just to highlight that all the four organizations are intergovernmental organizations, meaning that we are composed of member states. They tell us what to do through our governing bodies, and we report back to them on our work, on our progress. So one of the asks is to come up together and have this One Health joint plan of action following the COVID-19, and the understanding that no agency alone and no sector alone can prevent pandemics and respond even to the pandemic alone. So we developed this plan of action and we launched it at the World Health Summit last October in Berlin. And to give you an idea about the plan, we start with the impact. We need to achieve the world better able to prevent and then detect and then respond to health threat at the interface, not just pandemic, but also other health threats. And to do this, we need those sectors and disciplines to work together, and we need to do our work in a way that contribute to sustainable development. To achieve this, we have medium-term and long-term outcomes. They all centered around four C's, we call them: communication, coordination, collaboration, and capacity building. And the pathways of change that we have to go through to achieve this impact and the outcomes. And I will just highlight that this action plan is very comprehensive. It starts with the action track that we have to build the resilience of the health system. And to do this, we need competent One Health workforce. And then we talked about reducing the risk of pandemics, focusing on prevention, and of course, we should not neglect the neglected tropical disease and vector-borne diseases. And we should look at the issues of food safety, of course, AMR, as indicated by my colleague Pilar. And the final action track is how to integrate the environment into the One Health, which is very important for our work. So to give you an example of what this action plan it's about, from action track 2, it's about reducing the risk of emerging and re-emerging zoonotic diseases. We have three objectives. We need to understand the risk. Where is it coming from? How it's emerging? What are the spillover, the drivers of risk, of this risk, and how it's spread among the population? And from there, we have to prioritize targeted evidence-based upstream interventions for prevention, which is highlighted in John Luca's presentation. And we also need to work on the early warning system. We need to share information, of course, and we need to respond together to the threat. We have here a lot of actions, activities that we can do together to achieve these goals. Now, how we are going to implement this plan? As I said, we are member-led institutions and organizations. So we have to work with our countries to understand their situation, where they are, what are the gaps, prioritize these activities, engage with the wider stakeholders at all levels, and then use the coordination mechanism that we have for that and build in our existing mechanisms, because all these action tracks, we already have projects and initiatives working on them, but we have to scale them up or expand. For our interventions, it needs to be science-based and evidence-based. And for that, we constituted our One Health high-level expert panel in 2021 following the pandemic to provide us the quadripartite organization with scientific evidence to inform our policy making and our guidance to our member countries. We have 26 members, their term for 2 years. It's almost at the end of the first term, and now we are discussing how to refresh the panel and have the second term of this. And we have 4 working or thematic group under this One Health high-level expert panel. They supported us to understand better what's One Health, how to, and came up with this definition that all the presenters have showed to you, but also how to understand how to implement it in the field. And they are now supporting us to develop the guide for the implementation of the joint plan of action. We have also a stream on or thematic group working on identify the factors causing the spillover and the subsequent spread of disease. And we will show you later their work. So for the achievement, I mentioned a few of them, but for the interest of time, I will not go into the details, but just to highlight their One Health definition, because it's comprehensive. It's looking at not just at the 3 sectors and the disciplines that come with them, but also how to link it to the sustainable development and to integrate it into the work of the whole UN system. Importantly for this topic, we talk about the pandemic treaty and the work the member states are doing to negotiate the text. And there was a need to define what do we mean by prevention? Is it, as Gianluca said, talking about upstream prevention, but we already have frameworks for this, or the downstream, which the IHR covers, and supported by the performance of vet services. We call it BVS2. It's in the middle. It's this circle here. It's the spillover events. That's the legal blind spot that we want to highlight and provide input into. Is there a commitment, global commitment to this work that we are doing? Yes, and I just provide some examples from the G7 Health Minister communique that was published in 2022, where they welcome this operational definition of One Health, but also supported the consideration and the inclusion of the One Health into the new pandemic instrument. We also have the support from other political forum, which is the G20, and coming from this or streaming from this, it's the establishment of the pandemic fund hosted by the World Bank and with the technical support of WHO to provide countries with the financial means to do project to support pandemic prevention, preparedness, and response. So I will end up with this slide where just finished our annual executive meeting of the quadripartite, where we signed the joint call for action and encouraging and calling on our member countries and our stakeholders to work with us more closely to prioritize the One Health in the high-level political forum, to work and strengthen the prevention of pandemic, and to invest more into the One Health and into the prevention aspect. So I stop here and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Fantastic. So we have a couple of minutes left, and I really want to invite, yes, please. Would you like, yes, if you could come up to the podium, to the microphone.
Hi,
thank you.
Anne Trebilcock. Thank you very much for a very interesting panel. I was interested in the emphasis on prevention, on risk reduction, and puzzled by a lack of reference to work of the International Labor Organization, and I'm wondering why they are not part of the discussions on this issue, or if they are, that would be great. The reason for that in particular is that there are existing treaties dealing with occupational safety and health that incorporate ways and means of building in the types of interventions that you've been talking about. There is a specific International Labor Convention on the occupational safety and health of agricultural workers, including those, of course, who work with animals, and including, of course, ways of preventing transmission of diseases. The other thing that would be interesting to take into account is that in June 2022, the International Labor Conference adopted an amendment to the 1998 Declaration on Fundamental Principles and Rights at Work. And the amendment includes now that the right to safe and healthy working conditions is considered a fundamental principle and right at work. The implication of that is that even countries that have not ratified the ILO conventions on occupational safety and health will have to report regularly on the efforts that they are making to achieve the objectives and principles enshrined in those conventions. So thanks a lot.
Wow, thank you very much. That was very enlightening. I had been thinking about the labor aspect, to be fair, but would any of you like to respond to that? Chadia?
No, I was pointing to Gianluca.
Good question. I was hoping that representative of the organizations involved in the quadripartite would address that. I guess you're right. I mean, I guess the focus is different and is more, if you want, on the pathogen side and on the worker side. But what you said shows a gap, I think, and shows how even broader the institutional and regulatory dimension is, because you're right, if you talk about intensive farming, if you talk about slaughterhouses, those are places of work with an abysmal record of safety. And during COVID, you remember in the United States, I mean, how many people died, they had to shut down slaughterhouses and so on. And that's some of the hotspots for zoonotic spillover. So I can only acknowledge what you're saying, and I hope the colleague from PAHO and AWOHA are gathering the message, but I'm not sure that you will see us all of a sudden become a pentapartite. But anyway, I think that's a dimension that has been neglected for sure.
Yeah, if I may.
I?
Yes, definitely.
Actually, the decision on biodiversity and health, which speaks about One Health approach, very clearly refers and invites the One Health high-level panel and quadripartite to work more on the social determinants and other socioeconomic inequities, which would perhaps cover some of these issues relating to workmen, employment conditions, and safe working place.
Yeah, thank you. No, I cannot agree more. And of course, I cannot, I have to mention as well the healthcare workers and as well, of course, the protection that they should be ensured, and as well for themselves, and as well because in the hospital many times they can be amplifying epidemics as well. So the infection prevention and control is super important. So as well, we work specifically in occupational health in PAHO, in WHO, but for any reason, and I don't know, and I can go back to the organization, they are not included in this kind of specific conversation, and I found as well extremely relevant. But it's just to mention as well the relevance of the healthcare workers in this kind of situations.
Great. Any further questions? Yes, please.
Hi, my name is Terrence Neal. I'm an attorney at the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. So I had a question that's somewhat related to animal rights. So I've seen through this pandemic treaty process, there's been an interest in linking the One Health approach to human rights approaches, and I'm just wondering, given how much of the issue is related to animal treatment, whether there's been any discussions in relation to animal rights or a push by animal rights activists to have that be more of a component of both the One Health approach and the approach to pandemic response and prevention.
I can respond if you
Chadia,
want. Yes. Yeah, thank you so much for the question. Indeed, we are trying to embed this issue of animal health and welfare into the work that we do on One Health in general, but also into the legal frameworks. And we have a coalition of NGOs and international organizations supporting this work, including the World Vet Associations and Animal Action for Animal Health, for BOWS, and other conservation internationals and other colleagues who work on this. So there is a stream of work on this issue, and hopefully we will see this reflected in the drafting. Thank you.
May I intervene?
Yes, please.
So, thanks for that question. It's an interesting question, and that's something is a little bit concerning in the sense like One Health approach, as we were all discussing, it's a very interesting approach, a very traditionally supported approach. But when it gets into the context of pandemic treaty or pandemic instrument, the focus is really on the surveillance of pathogens, spillover kind of stuff. There are attempts to expanding it. It is very good, but a kind of observation is that towards the end of negotiations, I would say most of them would perhaps again dilute because of the issues of jurisdictional reach. That's a problem. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, I think I'll allow for, did you want to reply? No, okay, I'll allow for one more question and then our time has come to an end. And let's respect that, thanks.
Hello, my name is Johnny Green. I have a question about the data sharing portion concerning One Health. And my question is, how do you imagine we can incentivize countries to continue sharing and foster so much more transparency, especially knowing that times where countries have shared, like it's caused inequities or people have been exploited, or even in terms of sharing during COVID, borders are closed and it affects people's tourism industries and the capital of the country. So how do you think we can better incentivize countries to data share? Thank you.
I think that's a very, very good question and probably one of the hardest nuts to crack. Would any of you like to address these issues?
Maybe I can actually make another, because when you start speaking about data sharing, I was thinking about data sharing among sectors, because as well between sectors is a challenge as well, not only at the international level, but as well at the national level. This kind of data sharing in between sectors is a challenge. And in that case, at the national level, of course, regulations will facilitate and the adequate instruments to integrate data from different sectors. And as well, it's especially sensitive when this data can have an impact on economy or trade, and this, especially from the agricultural and veterinary and animal food production is quite sensitive. But we have experience in several countries. This kind of national regulation will help inside the countries. At international level, we have IHR as a tool that is a mandate. So the countries has to share the information on the new emergency threats or pathogens that will have an impact on the international global health. But still, this is like a specific emerging diseases, not is like a common surveillance system that brings a lot of different challenges. There are routine surveillance that is coordinated by WHO, and as well other institutions participate on that. But the main point is when this kind of information is perceived like a threat for economy or trade. So maybe you can provide.
Yeah, if someone else would like to respond, if not, we'll look at your final words for
50
the day.
seconds. So the issue there, excellent question, because if you're talking about surveillance, you generate genomic sequences and data and meta-information. What do you do with them? And the issues that are sort of looming in the negotiation of the pandemic treaty are fundamentally three. The first is the linkage with benefits. Biodiversity law has come to, unfortunately, a bit of a transactional way. If I share my biological resources, but now it's been expanded or may be expanded to data and genomic sequences, I expect benefit in return. And how to multilateralize this so it doesn't become transactional, but there's clearly the sort of equal footing of sharing and benefits is there. The second is what you said, is protecting compliance, basically. I share, like South Africa, disclose the Omicron variant, next day, basically all the flights have been suspended. That's a looming issue and very much a work in progress. To me, one of the weaknesses of the regime is this. And the third is the status of genomic sequences. It's not clearly regulated in the Biodiversity Convention or in any other treaty, so it's a bit of a legal vacuum. Many of these sequences or this information are deposited in databases that sometimes are run by countries, sometimes they're private, so with issues of access, with issues of contractual approach, like transnational law approach. So it's very much a work in progress, I think. But these are the issues being discussed in Geneva right now, by and large.
May I intervene on this? Because it's something which was reflecting to my reference. So with regard to the data sharing, there are several types of data which is being shared, one is based on genomic sequences and rest is other metadata kind of thing. So what is being asked is a very important thing, first of all. And when we speak about genetic sequence, we must understand that no databases are currently accountable to international organizations. We have seen last week or last 3 weeks some issues relating to it, how pathogen data has been shared in some database, and that's what is affecting on that. So there needs to be a clear understanding and discipline about the terms and use of conditions of databases, and they should be responsible and accountable to WHO. The third aspect is DSI. The genetic sequence information is very much covered under Nagoya Protocol as well as CPD, in the sense like there is a decision last adopted in December to share benefits arising out of this, and this is going to be operationalized in the coming days. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, everyone. Thank you to our wonderful panelists. Thank you to our audience for having attended, and I wish you all an excellent conference going forward.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.